Our last stop on the whirlwind tour of this section of the book is the vestibular system. Vestibular treatment in PT is a super interesting area of treatment. However, it is not usually something that you go into right out of school. Usually, you'll get some additional continuing ed in vestibular treatment after you've been working in the clinic for a while. I would say don't go right into vestibular. There's a lot that you need to learn before you go into vestibular. And the only way you're going to learn it is by working in the clinic. But we're going to briefly talk about the vestibular system. And then I'm going to have another section of the lecture talking about vestibular disorders, just so you know where they are. You might work in a clinic where you have a PT who specializes in vestibular, and eventually you might get certified in vestibular or get some additional training in vestibular treatment. And it is a fun area to work in, but it's definitely not considered entry level. So again, primary functions of the system, like we have been doing with all this systems we've talked about in this section. Describe the difference between central and peripheral vestibular disorders, and then signs and symptoms of some vestibular disorders that we will talk about. So the vestibular information that we get from the vestibular system is essential for postural control and for control of eye movements. So the vestibular apparatus basically transduces gravity information into neural energy that our brain can understand. So it has sensory receptors that respond to the position of the head relative to gravity and to head movements. So the information is transduced or converted into neural signals that are conveyed by the vestibular nerve to the vestibular nuclei in various parts of the brain. Okay, so a lot of our cerebellum has vestibular nuclei, our cerebrum has vestibular nuclei. There's the vestibular system has its little hand in a lot of things. So when you have vestibular disorder, it can mess up your life, which is why it's nice to be able to get treated for that. So there are projections from vestibular nuclei that contribute to sensory information about head movement and head position relative to gravity, gaze stabilization, so controlling eye movements when the head moves, postural adjustments, and autonomic function and consciousness. And just like a lot of the systems that we've talked about, the vestibular system has a peripheral part and a central part. So the vestibular apparatus is the peripheral part, and it consists of bony and membranous labyrinths and hair cells. There are receptors inside the membranous labyrinth that are hair cells. And they're not really hair, but they just call them that. The bending of the fibers or the hairs determines the frequency of signals conveyed by the vestibular nerve. So there's a physical movement that happens in the vestibular apparatus that transduces that information into neural energy. The vestibular apparatus has three semicircular canals that are oriented at right angles to each other. There is a really cool 3D model that you can look at on the internet. I will find a link to it and post it in Canvas. When you look at the 3D model, you're like, oh, isn't that interesting? And you can see how it can transduce those head movements. So the receptors in the semicircular canals detect movements of the head by sensing motion in the endolymph. And endolymph is the fluid that's on the inside of the semicircular canals. So the canals are made up of three hollow rings arranged perpendicular to each other. And each is open at both ends into the utricle and has an ampulla that contains a crista. So we'll just get all the terminology in there right away. So the crista is a body of supporting cells and sensory hair cells. The hair cells are embedded in a gelatinous mass called the cupula. So you can imagine they move and they transduce that movement information. So each canal in a pair produces reciprocal signals. So we have one on the right and one on the left. And so increased signals from one canal occur simultaneously with decreased signals from the canal on the other side of the head. So that's how the signals tell which way you're turning your head and how you're moving in space. So the reciprocal signals are essential for normal vestibular function. If one side's working and the other side isn't, that causes problems. So if signals from a pair of the semicircular canals are not reciprocal because one side's dysfunctional, then you'll have difficulties with the control of posture. So you'll have dizziness and unsteadiness, abnormal eye movements, and probably nausea and vertigo. So the semicircular canals have to work together, the two on either side. So you have two, one on the right, one on the left, in order for it to actually work. So the otolithic organs, so oto means ear and lithic means rocks. So these are rocks in your head, if you want to think of it, rocks in your ears. The organs are called the utricle and the saccule. Both are otolithic organs. They're membranous sacs within the vestibular apparatus. They're not sensitive to rotation, but they respond to head position relative to gravity and to linear acceleration and deceleration. The macula are the hair cells that are enclosed by a gelatinous mass topped by calcium carbonate crystals located within the utricle and the saccule. So those little calcium carbonate crystals, those are the rocks in your head, and they're called otoconia. Otoconia are calcium carbonate crystals that are denser than the surrounding fluid and the gelatinous support. So when you move your head relative to gravity, or you accelerate or decelerate, those rocks move on top of the gelatinous base and they stimulate the hair cells. Pretty cool, right? As you age, your otoconia, those calcium carbonate crystals, tend to break up more often and can cause you problems with BPPV, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Changing head positions tilts the macula, and the weight of the otoconia displaces the gelatinous mass, bending the embedded hairs. And the bending hairs stimulate or inhibit the hair cells depending on the direction of the bend, which determines the frequency of the firing of the neuron in the vestibular nerve. So I think that's pretty neat. Just put some rocks on top of Jello and you can do that. Very interesting. So the vestibular nerve transmits information. This is the central part. It transmits information from the semicircular canals and the otolithic organs to the vestibular nuclei in the medulla and pons, and to the cerebellum. So the peripheral part of the vestibular system is the vestibular apparatus and the outer part of the vestibular nerve, and the central part is from going from there to the medulla and pons in the cerebellum.